This week's laboratory in neuroanatomy is going to represent the last of our laboratories that we have for this trimester. This week is the capstone experience for the laboratory part of this course, in that we are going to be looking at coronal or frontal sections through the brain, and we are going to then look at cross sections or horizontal sections. During this time, we are going to be identifying major characteristics of the brain. The first series of images that we are going to look at are going to be frontal brain or coronal brain sections. And these sections will be taken at various depths within the brain. But the key for the identification of these structures that I'm going to have you find is always going to be that you need to have a landmark that you can always line up on that's going to help you to get your orientation. I personally use the ventricular system. Again, you can use whatever works for you, but I figure that I can always find spaces in the brain. So first of all, I identify the lateral ventricle. And that's going to become my reference point as I identify structures. Because I know that going across the top of the lateral ventricle, I'm going to see the corpus callosum. Now, for this laboratory, we are not really going to concern ourselves with various parts and pieces. In other words, we don't care whether that is the rostrum, the splenium. Again, we just want to be able to identify that as the corpus callosum. Just above the corpus callosum, you'll remember we always saw the cingulate gyrus. So this is where you're going to have to go back and think about what you're going to see on a sagittal view, on a lateral view, on an inferior view, because that's going to be very important as you work through this laboratory. Then, hanging down from the corpus callosum, we are going to have the septum pellucidum. And that septum pellucidum is going to be that membrane that is going to separate the lateral ventricles. Then we see this area of gray matter impinging upon the lateral side of the lateral ventricle. And we said that whenever we see that, that is going to be the caudate nucleus. As I move laterally, I'm going to see this large area of gray matter right here, and that is going to be the putamen. So two areas of gray matter are going to be reasonably consistent when we look at frontal sections, that being the caudate and the putamen. You may be able, if you look very, very carefully, you may be able to pick out a small little lighter staining area right there. That is going to be the globus pallidus. In between the caudate and the putamen, we have this band of white matter, which is going to be the anterior limb of the internal capsule. And then finally, on this section, if we move laterally, lateral to the putamen, we are going to see this line of gray matter that comes down right here. That is a structure called the colostrum. And we'll talk about the colostrum when we get to the tracts in Unit 4. And then finally, this area right here. This is called the insula. And the easiest way to identify the insula is that if you come in through the lateral fissure, this will be the first area of cerebrum that you will hit. So these are the structures that can be seen on this frontal section. Again, with a little bit of practice, you'll be able to pick these out very, very easily. So as I have done throughout these laboratories this is the same picture with now the list of structures that you will want to be able to identify on this frontal section. Our next frontal section is back behind the previous section that we looked at. And you can see that reference picture in the bottom left corner. But again, I want to start by identifying the ventricular system that we can see. So as I look at this, here are my lateral ventricles, and that's going to be my reference point. But this time, I can see this little slit right here. And that little slit is going to represent the third ventricle. And then finally, this dilated area, this is going to be the cerebral aqueduct. So as I look at the sections and I try to identify structures, I am always going to look for these reference points. Then I can identify structures. Because again, I can see this band going across the top of the lateral ventricles, and that has not changed. That is going to be the corpus callosum. Above the corpus callosum, I'm always going to look for the cingulate gyrus. Hanging down from the corpus callosum, I can see the septum pellucidum. But this time on the very, very bottom of the septum pellucidum, when I look right here and right here, I can see the fornix. Then I have this huge area of gray matter that is impinging upon the third ventricle. And you'll remember from lecture, we said that if we see gray matter impinging on the third ventricle, we are going to identify that as the thalamus. Again, we are not going to concern ourselves with parts and pieces. We just want to identify that as the thalamus. So therefore, the white matter on the outside of the thalamus, this has to be the posterior limb of the internal capsule. And then finally, as we move down, we are going to see the cerebral aqueduct. And so that's going to tell us that we are in the area of the midbrain. And right away, we see these dark staining structures right here. Those dark staining structures are going to be the substantia nigra. We'll remember from our study of Unit 2, right underneath substantia nigra, we are going to have cerebral peduncles. And then just above the substantia nigra, we see these little round-shaped areas right here. This is going to be the red nucleus. So these are the structures associated with the midbrain that we can see in this cross section. Then if I continue my way down, I can see the pons here, medulla down here. And then finally on this cross section, we have this little area out in the temporal lobe. And this area is the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is part of the limbic system. And again, we'll talk in great detail about the hippocampus when we get to the limbic system in Unit 3. So these are the major structures that we can see on this cross section. So as we look, we can see the cross section, we can see the list of terms that you will want to be able to identify on this frontal section of the brain. Just a continuation of our previous list of structures that you will want to be able to identify. Our last frontal section is going to be kind of in between the two previous sections. And again, I want to just identify structures that we can see. First of all, we can see our lateral ventricle. And so with the identification of the lateral ventricle, we can go through the litany of structures that we have identified up to this point. We can see the corpus callosum. We can see the cingulate gyrus. We can see the septum pellucidum. And we can see the fornix. On this section, we see this gray matter that is impinging upon the lateral side of the lateral ventricle. This is going to be the caudate nucleus. And then we can see right here this large dark staining mass, that is going to be the putamen. And the reason I selected this section is we can see the two parts of the globus pallidus. So with that in mind, we can identify then the anterior limb of the internal capsule. Then we can see the third ventricle. And based on where we are, we can identify this little area right here as the hypothalamus. Then these white structures here and here, these are part of the optic system. And then in between those two structures, right there is the infundibulum, or the pituitary stalk. As I move laterally, again, here's going to be my putamen on this side. I can see the colostrum here, running out of room as you can see. And then finally, I can identify the insula. So a lot of the same structures that we have identified up to this point, we can still see on all these frontal sections. So a lot of times it is just repeating the same structures over and over again. So here is our image with structures listed that you will want to be able to identify. Remember, we are not dealing with parts and pieces. So for example, globus pallidus is perfectly acceptable. And then a continuation from the previous slide of structures that you will want to be able to identify.